December 14, 1943. A dimly lit laboratory in Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. Professor Takeo Nakamura hunched over fragments of aluminum and twisted wiring, the salvaged remains of what Americans called radar countermeasures recovered from a downed B-17 bomber. His colleagues believed these devices were merely navigation aids, primitive tools that could never match Japanese intuition and skill. How terribly wrong they would soon discover themselves to be. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a handful of Japanese scientists uncovered the technological gulf that was swallowing their aircraft by the hundreds, and how this revelation would transform not just their understanding of the conflict, but the very way Japan viewed its position in the modern world. The heavy rain pattered against the laboratory windows as Professor Nakamura adjusted his spectacles, carefully examining the strange metal box under the harsh glow of the overhead lamp. At 52 years old, Nakamura was considered one of Japan's foremost experts in radio wave technology, having studied at both Tokyo Imperial University and briefly at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the early 1930s, before relations between the two nations deteriorated. Professor, the Vice Admiral is growing impatient for your assessment, said Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Yamamoto, a young naval officer assigned to oversee the research team. His uniform was impeccably pressed despite the late hour, standing rigidly beside Nakamura's workbench. "Science cannot be rushed, Commander," Nakamura replied without looking up, "especially when we are trying to understand why our finest pilots vanish over the Pacific, as if swallowed by the gods themselves." The laboratory housed 5 other scientists, each with their own specialties. Dr. Shigeru Tanaka, an electrical engineering genius who had helped develop Japan's own rudimentary radar systems. Ichiro Saito, a mathematician whose calculations had aided the design of the Zero fighter's aerodynamics. Kenji Watanabe, a former radio operator turned technical analyst. Fumiko Hayashi, one of the few female physicists in Japan who specialized in electromagnetic theory. And Tadashi Mori, a young graduate student who showed exceptional promise in materials science. For months, reports had been flooding in from the front lines about Japanese aircraft disappearing without trace, sometimes entire squadrons vanishing during what should have been routine missions. The Imperial High Command initially blamed pilot error, weather conditions, or simple mechanical failure. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Something was hunting their planes before they could even see the enemy. "Our aircraft losses have increased 300% since last year," Commander Yamamoto stated, reading from a folder stamped with the Imperial seal. "The Americans shoot down our planes at a rate of 7 to 1 compared to 6 months ago. They appear to know precisely where our forces will be, sometimes before our own pilots have even taken off." The laboratory had been working around the clock since receiving the salvaged equipment 3 days earlier. It had been recovered by a submarine crew who discovered the wreckage of an American bomber that had crashed in shallow waters near the Marshall Islands. "Commander," Nakamura said, finally looking up from his work, "what I am about to tell you contradicts everything our military leaders have assumed about American technological capabilities." Yamamoto's expression remained neutral, but his posture stiffened slightly. "These components," the professor continued, gesturing to the dismantled equipment spread across his workbench, "are part of an advanced radar system, unlike anything we have developed. The Americans are not simply detecting our aircraft. They are hunting them with electronic precision." Back in Washington, D.C., a very different conversation was taking place. In a secluded conference room within the Pentagon, Brigadier General Harold Spencer addressed a team of military officials and civilian scientists about Operation Countermeasure. "Gentlemen, our radar network is now fully operational across the Pacific Theater," Spencer announced, his voice filled with controlled enthusiasm. "The Japanese continue to fly blind, unaware that we can track their movements from hundreds of miles away." Dr. Robert Walters, a physicist who had been instrumental in developing the radar technology, nodded appreciatively. At 38, he had abandoned his academic career at Stanford University to join the war effort, bringing with him revolutionary ideas about radio wave detection. The latest SCR 584 units are performing beyond our expectations, Walters reported. We're detecting Japanese aircraft at ranges up to 180 miles in ideal conditions, giving our forces ample time to prepare interceptions. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, head of technical intelligence, added, "Our intelligence suggests the Japanese still believe we're relying primarily on visual spotters and basic radio direction finding. They have no concept of how sophisticated our radar network has become." Spencer turned to the large map on the wall, where red pins marked the locations of American radar installations throughout the Pacific Islands. The beauty of this system is its comprehensive coverage. There are now very few approaches to our positions that aren't monitored continuously. It's like having 1,000 pairs of eyes that never sleep, never blink, and can see through clouds and darkness. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were fighting an enemy who couldn't see them coming, while they could see everything. Back in Japan, Professor Nakamura's team worked feverishly to understand the American technology. In his private journal dated December 16, 1943, Nakamura wrote, "The American radar system utilizes frequencies and power outputs far beyond what our military leaders believed possible. Their ability to detect aircraft at such distances gives them an advantage that cannot be overstated. I fear we have gravely underestimated their scientific capabilities." When I attempted to explain the severity of this technological gap to Naval Command, I was met with disbelief and accusations of defeatism. They refused to accept that our enemies have surpassed us in this critical field. The reality was even more concerning than Nakamura initially realized. While Japan had developed basic radar systems, they were primitive compared to Allied technology. Japanese radar typically operated in the 150 MHz range with detection distances under 50 miles in optimal conditions. By contrast, American systems operated at 500 MHz and above, with significantly improved resolution and range. The production numbers told an even more alarming story. By late 1943, the United States was manufacturing over 5,000 radar sets monthly, while Japan struggled to produce 70 units in the same time frame. The American systems were also more reliable, with failure rates below 15% compared to Japan's 60%. In his laboratory, Nakamura conducted a simple demonstration for Commander Yamamoto and Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had finally come to see the research for himself. "This small aluminum sheet represents one of our aircraft," Nakamura explained, placing it inside a large water tank. He then activated a modified radio transmitter that sent waves through the water. The waves bounced off the metal sheet and returned to a receiver, which produced an audible tone. The Americans are essentially doing this, but with radio waves through air, and with such precision they can determine an aircraft's speed, altitude, and direction. Vice Admiral Kurita, a stocky man with a perpetually stern expression, watched the demonstration with growing concern. "If what you say is true, Professor, this explains the reports from our pilots about being ambushed even in heavy cloud cover." "It is worse than that." "Admiral," Nakamura continued, "based on the components we've analyzed, the Americans can likely detect our ships at sea from considerable distances as well." This revelation struck Kurita like a physical blow. The proud Japanese Navy had always relied on the vastness of the Pacific to shield its movements. The concept that American forces could detect their ships beyond the horizon seemed almost supernatural to many naval officers. "What countermeasures can we develop?" Kurita demanded. "With respect, Admiral, developing effective countermeasures would require us to first close an enormous technological gap," Nakamura replied carefully. "It would be like asking a man with a sword to fight against firearms. We must first understand and replicate their technology before we can hope to counter it." Dr. Fumiko Hayashi, who had been quietly analyzing the radar components' materials, spoke up. "Admiral, there is another concerning factor. The quality of American electronic components far exceeds our manufacturing capabilities. Their capacitors, vacuum tubes, and wiring show precision engineering that our factories simply cannot match at present." The Admiral's face darkened. "Are you suggesting the Americans are inherently superior, Doctor?" "Not at all, Admiral," she replied calmly. I'm stating a scientific fact about current industrial capacities. The Americans have converted their entire economy to war production with an efficiency we did not anticipate. They are producing electronic components with consistency and in quantities we cannot currently match. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American radar operators were demonstrating the system's capabilities. At a radar station on Guadalcanal, Sergeant Mike Donovan and his team monitored their screens around the clock. The station was part of an integrated network that shared information across islands, creating a comprehensive detection grid. Contact bearing 270, range 150 miles, altitude approximately 20,000 feet, called out operator Sam Wilson. Speed suggests a formation of enemy bombers. Within minutes, this information was relayed to fighter squadrons, anti-aircraft batteries and command centers. American Corsair fighters were airborne before the Japanese planes reached the outer defensive perimeter, allowing them to climb to optimal interception altitude and position themselves advantageously. For the approaching Japanese pilots, the experience was bewildering and terrifying. Flying through clear skies, they would suddenly find themselves surrounded by American fighters that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, perfectly positioned for attack. Flight Lieutenant Toshio Kato, one of the few survivors of these interceptions, later reported, "It was as if the Americans were guided by Tengu spirits. They knew exactly where we were, how many aircraft we had, and at what altitude we were flying. Our element of surprise was non-existent. Before we could even see their islands, their fighters were already upon us." Back in Yokosuka, Professor Nakamura's team worked day and night to reverse engineer the captured radar components. Their efforts were hampered by limited resources and the increasing difficulty of obtaining necessary materials as American submarines tightened their blockade of the Japanese home islands. The high-quality vacuum tubes they use require manufacturing precision we currently lack, Nakamura explained to a group of naval officers and government officials who had come to inspect their progress. Even if we had the designs, our factories would struggle to produce them in sufficient quantities and quality. Ichiro Saito, the mathematician, had been analyzing interception patterns using reports from surviving pilots. His findings were equally troubling. "The Americans are not merely detecting our aircraft," he explained, pointing to charts spread across a large table. "They are calculating interception vectors with mathematical precision. Their radar information is being integrated with computational methods that allow them to predict our movements and respond accordingly." The officials listened with growing unease as the scientists methodically outlined the technological chasm between the two nations. Japan had entered the war believing in the superiority of its fighting spirit and the quality of its weapons. Now they were confronting the reality that faith and courage were insufficient against an enemy who could see in the dark, through clouds, and beyond the horizon. In January 1944, Professor Nakamura's team completed their preliminary report on American radar capabilities. The document, classified at the highest level, laid out in stark terms the technological disparity and its implications for the war effort. The report stated, "American radar technology represents an advancement that fundamentally changes the nature of naval and aerial warfare. Their ability to detect our forces at ranges exceeding 150 miles in all weather conditions, day or night, negates our traditional tactical advantages. Additionally, their industrial capacity allows them to produce these sophisticated systems in quantities we cannot hope to match under current conditions." The report included recommendations for immediate and long-term responses, including the development of radar-absorbent materials, changes in aircraft approach vectors, and a massive investment in Japan's own radar technology. However, Nakamura harbored private doubts about whether such measures could be implemented quickly enough to make a difference. In his personal diary, he wrote, "Today, I presented our findings to the Naval General Staff. Some officers received the information with appropriate gravity, but others seemed unable or unwilling to accept the implications. One senior admiral suggested that American radar could be countered simply by the fighting spirit of our pilots. Such thinking represents a dangerous disconnection from scientific reality." The reactions to Nakamura's report varied widely within Japanese military leadership. Some, particularly younger officers with technical backgrounds, recognized the serious threat posed by this technological gap. Others, especially older commanders steeped in traditional military doctrine, downplayed its significance or rejected the findings outright. Vice Admiral Kurita, however, took the report seriously. "If the Americans can see us, but we cannot see them, we must adapt our strategies accordingly," he stated during a staff meeting. "We cannot fight the same way we did at the beginning of the conflict." In March 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to implement some of the countermeasures suggested by Nakamura's team. Aircraft were instructed to fly at extremely low altitudes when approaching American positions, using the curvature of the Earth to stay below radar coverage. Ships began employing zigzag patterns and operating under radio silence to reduce detectability. Yet the results were discouraging. American radar technology continued to improve, with newer systems capable of detecting even low-flying aircraft. Moreover, the U.S. Navy had begun deploying radar picket ships, vessels stationed far from the main fleet, whose sole purpose was to provide early warning of approaching Japanese forces. At the same time, American industrial production continued to accelerate. According to intelligence reports that reached Nakamura's team, U.S. factories were now producing over 8,000 radar sets monthly, more than Japan had manufactured during the entire conflict thus far. Dr. Tanaka, the electrical engineer on Nakamura's team, had been working on developing Japan's own advanced radar system. His prototype, though promising, highlighted the resource challenges they faced. "The American system uses approximately 20 specialized vacuum tubes," he explained during a demonstration. "Each must be manufactured to precise specifications. Our prototype requires similar components, but our factories can only produce them at 1/10 the reliability. For every functioning radar set, we must discard parts for several others due to manufacturing defects." The human dimension of this technological disparity was vividly illustrated in the experiences of pilots on both sides. American pilots described a growing confidence as their radar systems evolved. Lieutenant David Anderson, flying F-6F Hellcats with VF-16 Squadron, wrote in a letter home, "Our new equipment gives us an incredible advantage. We know exactly where the enemy is, how many planes they have, and at what altitude they're flying. It's like having a map of the battlefield that the other side can't see. Some days it almost doesn't seem fair." In contrast, Japanese pilots faced increasingly daunting odds. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, a brilliant tactical officer who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor operation, collected reports from returning pilots that painted a grim picture. "Our pilots report that American fighters appear to be waiting for them, perfectly positioned for attack," he noted in a memo to his superiors. "Regardless of what approach vector we use, what time of day we attack, or what weather conditions prevail, they always seem to know we are coming." By April 1944, Professor Nakamura had become increasingly concerned about the psychological impact of this invisible technology on Japanese forces. "Beyond the tactical disadvantage," he wrote in a supplementary report, "there is a significant psychological effect on our personnel. Pilots and sailors increasingly believe the Americans possess almost supernatural abilities to detect their presence. This perception damages morale and fighting effectiveness as surely as any physical weapon." This psychological dimension manifested in changed behaviors among Japanese forces. Pilots became hesitant to approach American positions, sometimes aborting missions at the first sign of interception. Ship captains grew reluctant to venture into areas where American forces might be present, limiting their operational effectiveness. The technological disparity extended beyond just detection capabilities. The Americans were also developing electronic countermeasures that could jam Japanese communications and the limited radar systems they did possess. By mid-1944, American bombers were dropping strips of aluminum foil, codenamed Window by the British and Chaff by the Americans, to confuse Japanese radar operators during bombing runs. When samples of this simple yet effective countermeasure reached Nakamura's laboratory, he demonstrated its principles to his team. "These strips of aluminum are cut to precisely half the wavelength of radar signals," he explained. When thousands are released into the air, they create a cloud of false returns that can blind radar systems. Once again, the Americans are demonstrating sophisticated understanding of electromagnetic principles applied to warfare. The summer of 1944 brought further revelations, as Nakamura's team managed to salvage additional American radar equipment from downed aircraft and sunken vessels. The newer systems showed continued advancement in capabilities, with improved resolution and reliability. Dr. Hayashi, analyzing the materials used in these newer systems, made another significant discovery. The Americans are now using components that incorporate synthetic materials we cannot yet produce, she reported. These materials provide better insulation, reduced weight, and increased durability compared to the natural materials we rely upon. The production figures continued to tell the story of a widening gap. By August 1944, American factories were producing over 12,000 radar sets monthly, while Japanese monthly production remained under 100 units. Moreover, the quality disparity meant that many Japanese systems failed within weeks of deployment, while American systems typically operated reliably for months. In Washington, the radar program continued to receive enormous resources and priority. Dr. Walters and his team were now working on even more advanced systems that could distinguish between different types of aircraft based on their radar signatures. "We are moving beyond simply detecting the enemy to identifying exactly what we're detecting," he explained during a briefing to military leaders. "Soon we'll be able to tell from the radar return alone whether we're looking at fighters, bombers, or transport aircraft. This capability would further extend the American advantage, allowing them to prioritize threats and allocate defensive resources with unprecedented efficiency." The technological gap was not merely maintaining, it was actively widening as American scientific and industrial capabilities accelerated. For Professor Nakamura and his team, this reality was becoming increasingly difficult to confront. They were scientists dedicated to truth and facts, yet the truth they uncovered was profoundly troubling for their nation's prospects. "We face not merely a battle of technologies, but a fundamental disparity in industrial capacity and scientific application," Nakamura stated during a private meeting with Vice Admiral Kurita in September 1944. "The Americans have created a system where scientific discovery is rapidly converted to practical military application, then mass-produced with quality control we cannot currently match." Kurita, who had become one of the few senior officers to fully grasp the implications of Nakamura's research, nodded gravely. "What you are describing goes beyond this conflict," he said after a long pause. "It speaks to the future of Japan itself and how we must change to survive in the modern world." This conversation reflected a growing realization among some Japanese leaders that the war was exposing fundamental weaknesses in Japan's approach to industrialization and modernization. The emphasis on spirit and tradition had value, but without corresponding advancement in scientific education, industrial processes, and technological innovation, Japan found itself increasingly outmatched. The human toll of this technological disparity continued to mount. Japanese pilot survival rates plummeted as American interception capabilities improved. Training programs struggled to replace losses quickly enough, leading to less experienced pilots facing increasingly difficult odds. Flight Officer Hiroki Tanabe, one of the few experienced pilots still serving by late 1944, described the changing situation in a letter to his brother. "When I first began flying combat missions, we approached American positions with confidence, certain in our superior training and aircraft. Now each mission feels like a desperate gamble. They see us coming from impossible distances. Our newest pilots sometimes survive only 1 or 2 missions before being lost. How can one fight an enemy that sees through clouds, through darkness and beyond the horizon?" As 1944 drew to a close, Professor Nakamura's team had succeeded in developing a Japanese radar system with capabilities approaching early American models from 1942. While this represented significant progress, it also highlighted how far behind they remained. By the time these systems could be produced in meaningful numbers, American technology would have advanced even further. In December 1944, exactly 1 year after beginning their investigation, Nakamura submitted a comprehensive final report on the radar disparity and its implications. The document was both a technical assessment and a broader analysis of the scientific and industrial factors that had created this situation. The American radar advantage represents not merely a single technological innovation, but the culmination of systematic advantages in scientific education, industrial capacity, and resource allocation, the report concluded. Addressing this disparity requires not just specific technical countermeasures, but fundamental reconsideration of how Japan approaches modern warfare and industrial development. The report included detailed technical specifications of American radar systems, analysis of their industrial production methods, and recommendations for both immediate tactical responses and long-term strategic changes. However, by this point in the conflict, the ability to implement such comprehensive changes was increasingly limited. In his private reflections, recorded in his journal on December 25, 1944, Nakamura wrote words he could never share officially. "Today I visited a training field where young pilots are preparing for special attack missions. These young men, barely out of boyhood, are being sent to certain death, not just because of our nation's desperate situation, but because we failed to recognize and address the technological revolution occurring across the Pacific. Their sacrifice is made necessary not just by military defeats, but by our collective failure to embrace scientific advancement with the same vigor as our adversaries. This is a burden I shall carry for whatever remains of my life." The final months of the conflict saw Japanese forces increasingly hampered by the radar disadvantage and the broader technological gap it represented. American forces maintained continuous radar coverage over vast areas of the Pacific, detecting and intercepting Japanese movements with relentless efficiency. In a last desperate effort to counter radar detection, Japanese military leaders authorized a program to coat aircraft with experimental radar-absorbent materials developed based on Nakamura's research. However, the materials were in short supply, difficult to apply effectively, and provided only marginal reduction in radar signature, insufficient to overcome the sensitivity of newer American systems. The scientific and industrial lessons of the radar gap would ultimately extend far beyond the conflict itself. In the post-war years, many of the scientists who had worked on Nakamura's team, including Nakamura himself, would become influential voices advocating for Japan's scientific and technological modernization. In his final wartime report, submitted in July 1945, Nakamura wrote, "The technological disparity we have documented represents not merely a military disadvantage, but a challenge to our nation's future. In the world that will emerge from this conflict, national strength will be measured not just by fighting spirit and cultural traditions, but by scientific advancement, industrial efficiency, and technological innovation. Japan must learn this lesson if it is to recover and prosper." This perspective would prove prophetic. In the decades following the war, Japan would transform itself into a technological and industrial powerhouse, embracing scientific education, research and development, and precision manufacturing. The painful lessons learned by Nakamura's team about the radar gap would contribute to a national determination never again to fall behind in critical technologies. For the scientists who had uncovered and documented this technological disparity, the experience was transformative on a personal level as well. They had begun their investigation believing they would find weaknesses or limitations in American technology that could be exploited. Instead, they discovered a sobering reality about their own nation's scientific and industrial limitations. Dr. Tanaka, in a conversation with Nakamura during the final days of the conflict, expressed this transformation. "When we began this research, I believed we would quickly understand and counter the American radar advantage. I was confident in our abilities as Japanese scientists and engineers. Now I understand that individual brilliance cannot overcome systematic disadvantages in education, industrial capacity, and resource allocation." This is perhaps the most important lesson of our work, that scientific advancement depends not just on individual genius, but on entire systems of development and production. The story of Japan's radar awakening illustrates a profound truth about modern warfare and technological development. In an age of rapid scientific advancement, nations that fail to prioritize education, research, and industrial modernization risk finding themselves fighting not just against enemy forces, but against the future itself. For the Japanese pilots whose disappearance had prompted Nakamura's investigation, the radar gap represented a tragic example of how technological disparities translate directly into human costs. They fought with courage and skill, but against an enemy who could see them when they could not see in return. Even the greatest bravery was insufficient. The American radar operators who tracked those aircraft rarely saw the human consequences of their work. Sitting before screens in remote stations, watching blips that represented aircraft and the people within them, they experienced warfare at a technological remove that would increasingly characterize modern conflict. In his final journal entry before the end of the war, dated August 12, 1945, Professor Nakamura wrote, "The Americans could see our planes, our ships, our movements, while we remained blind. This technological disparity shaped the entire conflict more profoundly than any individual battle or campaign. Yet the greater tragedy is that this gap was not inevitable. It resulted from choices made years before about education, industry, and scientific priorities. If there is hope for Japan's future, it lies in understanding this lesson and ensuring we never again fall behind in the technologies that will shape the world to come." Years later, in 1965, an elderly Nakamura would be invited to address students at Tokyo University about his wartime experiences. His closing remarks summarized the enduring lesson of the radar gap. Technology without wisdom is dangerous, but wisdom without technology is helpless. Japan's future prosperity depends on achieving both, the scientific and technical knowledge to create advanced technologies and the wisdom to use them for the betterment of humanity rather than its destruction. This is the true lesson we must learn from understanding why our planes disappeared from the skies. The mysterious disappearance of Japanese aircraft had begun as a tactical puzzle, but revealed a strategic reality with implications far beyond the conflict itself. The investigation into American radar capabilities had uncovered not just the specific technology that gave the Allies such advantage, but the broader scientific and industrial ecosystem that made such innovation possible. For Nakamura and his team, this realization was both professionally humbling and nationally transformative. Their work had begun with the narrow goal of understanding an enemy technology, but concluded with insights about the very nature of modern technological development and its role in national power. In the decades that followed, Japan would emerge as one of the world's leading technological innovators, producing advanced electronics, precision machinery, and sophisticated systems that in many cases surpassed American capabilities. The scientists who had once struggled to understand captured radar components would help build an educational and industrial system designed to ensure Japan would never again find itself technologically outmatched. The radar gap that had once caused Japanese planes to disappear from the skies would ultimately contribute to the appearance of Japanese technological products in homes and businesses around the world, a transformation that Professor Nakamura lived long enough to witness with quiet satisfaction. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.